I want to ask you a question this morning. What would it be like if you were just in a place where you were truly welcomed? Like, just think about just truly welcome for who you are, not for anybody trying to like make you be something else. What would it look like just to be truly welcome for who you are? Like the kind of welcome I remember at my grandparents' house growing up. I was the firstborn grandchild, and I would always the only place I ever wanted to be was at my pop and my nana's house. And in the garage, I remember there was a refrigerator in the garage, which I thought was like really cool as a kid. And there were always like ice cold root beers in there, and glass bottles, and Coca-Cola bottles that we put peanuts in. Like these memories, and that was so neat for me because I didn't have anything like that at home. I guess at home it was Diet Coke and whatever we drank in the 90s. I don't know, but anyways, it was like just this. That's where I wanted to be, and I was always welcome for who I was. And I always, like, the thing I wanted most was for my uncle to finally move out of the house so that I could move in and take his bedroom at their house. But that is where I wanted to be. Now, if you've ever had a relationship like this, like there may be a relationship with your grandparents or with somebody else, you know what I mean. You know what it's like to be in a place or to be with people that don't ask you to prove who you are before the love comes, that don't ask you to look a certain way or act a certain way before the welcome comes. You don't have to wonder if you belong. You know that you're valued, that you're welcome, that you are known. But not every place feels like this. Not every relationship feels like this. Many of us walk around feeling unwelcomed or uninvited, sometimes even in our own circles. Sometimes you might walk into a space and wonder, do they even want me here? I know that there's been a bunch of kids, a bunch of young people that have been wondering this over the past few weeks. I mean, just imagine being in middle school and walking into the lunchroom for the first day of school, and the whole place is filled, and you're like, well, where do I sit? And nobody thinks anybody wants to sit next to them, and nobody wants to sit next to anybody else. And you can just kind of feel what that's like. And you've got your lunch tray or your lunch box. You're like, where do I sit? Would anybody want me to sit with them? Even your friends, you're like, I don't know if they actually want me to sit with them because they're already talking to somebody else. Or maybe you're not in middle school. Maybe you go to a party, or you get invited by a friend to go to a party, and you get to the party and you realize that once you walk in, you're a little late, and everybody already knows each other. So there's a lot of conversation happening around in different corners of the room, and so you're like, well, maybe I'll just go get some food, get something to drink, and then you look up and you survey around the room, and it's like, okay, here's a group, but nobody's around me, and they look like they're having fun, but what would it be like? Do I go up to them? Do I talk to them? Do I try to put myself in their, like, in this conversation, or does anybody really want me here? Why am I here? Or maybe you felt this way in your own family. You know, there's this rule, whether it's written or not, that you might prove your worth to feel you're loved. That you have to show and be something different to get the love of those around you. Do these people really want me here? Or maybe you felt this way at church or at a new church. Maybe you've been to church for many years, or you're exploring church, and you're like, you ask yourself, what do I need to hide in myself? What do I need to hide in my life to be accepted, to be welcome? You know, experiences like this teach us that we have to do something in order to be included. That we have to look a certain way, act a certain way, do something to be included. Experience says that belonging is great, but there's often strings attached. And if you do this, or if you act a funny way, or if your kids act up and act a certain way, that if you don't fit this standard mold, you might be sort of welcomed, or people might be nice to you, but only really at an arm's length. Like, they're not really going to want you in. They're only going to hold you at an arm's length and say, yeah, you're welcome, but only sometimes. And on top of this, maybe you carry some uncertainty into your beliefs about God, or into your relationship with God. You know, if you're somebody who's following Jesus and trying to to grow closer to God, maybe you have this idea and you're uncertain if your relationship with God is are there strings attached? You know, not only do you have to prove yourself to be welcomed by others, surely God's like that, and God is like really amazing and I'm really not. And so maybe there's certain things I need to do or act to be welcomed by God. And if you've ever felt this way, if you've ever felt like an outsider, whether it's all the time or like just sometimes, I want you to know that you are not alone. Today, I want to share with you a story of when Jesus welcomed some real ultimate outsiders. And he welcomed them into a new kind of community. And when Jesus welcomed them into this new kind of community, the welcome grew, the welcome expanded. And so if you've got a Bible, if you want to follow along, I'm going to be looking at the book of Matthew in chapter 9. And Matthew is the first book of the New Testament and was written by a follower of Jesus, a guy named Matthew, real inventive. But he was written by Matthew who was just trying to tell about the life and the ministry of Jesus. And what I'm going to share with you today, we read about the time when Jesus met Matthew and when Matthew met Jesus. Here's what it says in Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 9. As Jesus continued on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. And Jesus said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. As Jesus sat down to eat in Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners joined Jesus and his disciples at the table. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with the tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. Go and learn what this means. I want mercy, not sacrifice. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners." So before Matthew met Jesus, Matthew was a tax collector. Now, if you're like normal people, you don't like to pay your taxes, and like that's fine. I don't particularly like it either. But when we think about tax collecting and tax collectors in the first century, is a little bit different than today, because what you had is you had these people who were sent by the Roman Empire, and they were in these communities and they were tasked with collecting taxes from their neighbors. And the way that these folks often got their own salary and made their own money is that they collected additional fees over above the taxes that were owed. So they would come up to you and say, you know, you owe this amount, and they just put some of it in their pocket. So these were people who got wealthy by exploiting their neighbors. And you can imagine that they were distrusted, they were considered dishonest, that these were not people who were liked. They had a bad reputation. They would overcharge the assigned tax amount. They would put it in their pocket. They would get bribes from wealthy people so that the wealthy people could avoid paying taxes altogether. They created their own wealth by exploiting their neighbors. And as such, by this time, and if you read much in the Bible, you will find that the term tax collectors in general is just kind of slang or like a euphemism for scum of the earth. So if you want to know somebody that's really bad, it's like they're a tax collector. And that's just like this general, like really bad thing to be. So when we read about what happens in this text, it's surprising. It's surprising because Jesus is spending time with people who are considered scum of the earth. And so what's happening is that Jesus is in his hometown of Capernaum, and he has just healed somebody. And then after he's healed this person, he comes alongside Matthew. And Matthew is just sitting at his booth, doing his normal stuff, probably defrauding people, getting a little extra money in his pocket so that he can do the things that he needs to do in life. It's likely that Matthew knows Jesus by reputation because he was getting a following at this time. But we don't know that Matthew and Jesus ever met before. And so when Jesus comes up to Matthew and he says, "Follow me," I wonder if Jesus was just like walking by and he's like, "Follow me," or if he walks up to Matthew directly and he says, "Follow me." But whatever the case, it's just one simple invitation, one simple question. And there's something that is compelling about this question to Matthew. There's something that is compelling about this invitation to Matthew, that his whole choices in his life kind of flash before his eyes, and he's like, you know what? Yeah, I don't know really who this guy is, but I know he's starting to do some amazing stuff. And so I am going to follow him. So Matthew gets up from his tax collector booth and he goes and follows Jesus. Matthew does not have to prove that he's worthy before Jesus welcomes him. And then Jesus moves towards Matthew before Matthew moves towards Jesus. Jesus sees not only who Matthew has been, but he sees Matthew as a person of worth, and he extends the welcome. You don't have to prove you're worthy to be welcomed by Jesus. This welcome doesn't end here. In fact, the welcome widens. Jesus ends up at Matthew's house eating supper. And he's eating with Matthew's coworkers. None of his neighbors want to don't want to eat with him because he's got a bad reputation. But his coworkers are like, well, I have nobody else to eat with, so I'm going to eat with Matthew. And so Jesus is at Matthew's house eating with his coworkers, other tax collectors. The Bible identifies these people just as tax collectors and sinners. So these are people who have a bad reputation in town. And that's who Jesus is gone to eat with after inviting Matthew into this welcome. And so even though these dinner guests are known for their bad reputation, these are people that Jesus welcomes nonetheless. These are people that they wouldn't be welcomed in polite society, but Jesus sees these folks as people of worth, and he begins to welcome them. The welcome widens. Now, the text doesn't say that the rest of these folks ended up leaving their lives of tax collecting, leaving their lives of sin or whatever is happening, but what it does say is that Jesus welcomed people who others considered as unwelcomable. And in doing this, Jesus begins to flip the assumption of who is welcome in the embrace of God. So when I think about eating dinner at somebody's house or having a dinner party or people coming over for dinner at my house, what happens next in this story seems strange. Because when you go to somebody's house for dinner, usually the people that are there are the people that are invited. And you go inside, somebody knocks on the door, you open the door and you welcome inside, you offer them something to drink, eat, and you have a nice evening. But your neighbors might see that there's cars outside or that's people's coming in, but your neighbors don't know what's happening on the inside. Even if you're on your porch eating supper with friends, they might overhear a laughter or something happening once in a while, but it's not like a public affair because a dinner party or a dinner at somebody's house today is a private affair. But this dinner party that Jesus was at, this time of eating that Jesus was at Matthew's house, it would have been completely different because it wasn't private. And in fact, privacy in the first century in the region of Palestine is not what we think of today because people's houses were close together necessarily. And sometimes your house would open right on into the street. And so when Jesus was going to Matthew's house, the windows are open. There's no climate control. The windows are open. The doors are probably open and people are there. And meanwhile, Jesus kind of draws a crowd on himself, and so people are there, and then not only are the people there who are eating, but there's people just looking at him. They're like, what's going on here? Jesus is supposed to be this nice guy, and he's eating with these ridiculous folks. And so people are looking in, concerned about what's happening. And then we find the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, these are just the religious leaders of the day, and they act scandalized by those whom Jesus is welcoming. I always wonder if the way they're scandalized by this, if they're just putting on a show to say like, yeah, this is ridiculous, or if they really, really mean it. But they act scandalized by the people that Jesus is welcoming. They know that these tax collectors and these sinners, that they are not worthy to be welcomed by anyone, so they start to grumble. They start to complain. Matthew tells us that they start to complain to Jesus' disciples about the people that Jesus is eating with, but Jesus hears them. And so Jesus responds. And if they're talking loud enough for Jesus to hear them, they're talking loud enough for the other dinner guests to hear them. They're talking loud enough for the people that are being entertained to hear them. And so if you were one of the tax collectors or so-called sinners eating with Jesus, you hear people talking about you just right outside the window. And you're like, okay, here it is. What would you be thinking? You hear the religious leaders complaining about you, and you know that it's common. You know this happens all the time. And then you hear Jesus start to speak. You hear Jesus start to respond, and maybe you start thinking, okay, here it is. What happens, what always happens is going to happen again. Jesus is going to leave, and we're going to be left on the outside, and we know what's going to happen, the same thing that always happens. We're going to be cast aside because nobody wants to include us. But Jesus does something that nobody has ever done. He doesn't criticize you. He doesn't demand anything from you. Instead, he criticizes the people that are looking down on you. He criticizes the people on the outside, and the welcome continues. You don't have to prove you're worthy to be welcomed by Jesus. So here, those who are not used to being included, those who aren't used to being welcomed, those who are used to being on the outside are on the inside, and those who are used to being welcomed and those who are used to being on the inside are left on the outside. The religious leaders, they assume that they know what it takes to get close to God. They assume that they know what it means to be faithful and to keep themselves away from people like Matthew and the other sinners. But Jesus says, no, you're missing the point, friends. Healthy people don't need a doctor. It's the sick that do. And so the religious leaders, they think they are healthy. They think that they are righteous. They've been doing everything right in their religious lives. They know that they're close to God. They think that they have it all figured out as much as they can. They think they're doing everything that they need to do to be faithful. But somehow they're missing what is most important here. It's not that Jesus says that the religious people can never be welcomed. It's that they're also welcomed in the same way that the sinners are. Because the reality with these religious folks, it's not that they're never welcomed, but that they think that they're worthy to be welcomed on their own instead of realizing that they have the same problems as everybody else, that they need something too. The religious leaders think that faithfulness is about proving their worth and their abilities and their faithfulness. They're stuck trying to prove themselves worthy instead of just admitting that they need mercy and that they need welcome too. They can identify with the need of the so-called sinners, but they can't recognize the need of themselves for this same grace. You don't have to be worthy to be welcomed by Jesus. And then, and what happens next, I haven't read it yet, but I will. And what happens next, we find two more people who get welcomed by Jesus. One is actually a religious leader. This text will refer to him as a ruler, and the other is a hurting woman. And so at one point, these two may have assumed that their acceptance depended on them being worthy, depended on them doing something, acting a certain way, depended on them proving their worth, but their lives have become so helpless and so hopeless in their own specific ways that they confess their need, and they're like, you know what, I need help. I need to be welcomed by Jesus, and they are welcomed by Jesus just as they are. So here's what happens. During supper, as this supper is happening, while many of the religious leaders are complaining about Jesus, a ruler who's really a leader in the religious community comes up to Jesus, and here's what happens in verse 18. It says that while Jesus was speaking to them, a ruler came and knelt in front of him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and place your hand on her, and she'll live." So I'm thinking about this. Maybe this guy would have been where the rest of the religious leaders were, just thinking that his own righteousness, his own abilities were enough. But his daughter's just died. He's like, I don't have anything left. I need something. So he goes to Jesus and he asks. So Jesus and the disciples, they got up and went with him. Immediately, nothing else happens. They got up and went with him. And along the way, there's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. And she came up behind Jesus and just touches the hem of his clothes. And she thought, if only I touch his robe, I will be healed. But then Jesus turned and saw her and said, "Be encouraged, daughter. Your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed from that time on. And then we continue reading. The story goes on, but then Jesus ended up at the leader's house, the synagogue leader's house, and he healed his daughter. Just when we might be thinking that Jesus is not really about welcome, but maybe about drawing different lines, lines between who is in and who is out, and excluding religious folks and including sinners. Here we see a religious leader who's also welcomed by Jesus. Here we see somebody that is very similar to those who are criticizing Jesus being welcomed by Jesus. And this guy realizes that he can't prove himself worthy because he has nothing left. His whole life is shattered. He realizes his need and he asks Jesus for help. And Jesus immediately welcomes him, cares for him, and takes care of his need. And the same is true for this woman, because for years she had been excluded by others. Her illness would have made her unworthy, untouchable by many in polite society, in the same category as these tax collectors and sinners. But Jesus welcomes her, heals her, and he calls her daughter. He calls her family. Different people, different needs. You don't have to be worthy. You don't have to prove yourself worthy to be welcomed by Jesus. In many areas of life, people spend an enormous amount of energy trying to prove themselves. Maybe this is something you do as well. Maybe this is something you have done. You try to prove that you're strong enough, that you're good enough, that you've got it together enough. Maybe you try to prove that your family is doing fine enough, or that your finances are under control and that you don't need anyone's help. But you don't have to prove you're worthy to be welcomed by Jesus. As we consider Jesus inviting Matthew and Jesus inviting others, what would it look like for you to receive the same welcome in your life? What would it look like for you to receive the same welcome in your life? Just an invitation? Just a welcome? What would it look like for you to give up trying to prove your worth and instead just bring your need to Jesus? Whatever that need is, just bring it to Jesus. And it doesn't really matter where your starting point is. Maybe you identify in today's story with the sin-sick people who seem very far away from Jesus, the tax collectors. Or maybe you identify with the religious leaders, somebody who thinks that all they need to do is work hard enough to win. Wherever you begin, it doesn't really matter. All that really matters is that Jesus is offering an opportunity, an invitation of welcome. And all you have to do is stop trying to prove your worth on your own. All you have to do is accept the welcome of Jesus. Now, I don't know if you've done this before. I don't know if you've done this 100 times before in your life, or maybe you're considering it for the first time, but I just want to invite you to identify one area of your life, just whatever's going on in your life. Think about your life and identify one area of your life where you have need. One area of your life where maybe you feel ashamed. One area of your life where maybe you feel unworthy, not good enough, broken, unable to fix yourself. When you identify that place, I just want to invite you to bring it to Jesus. Just bring that need to Jesus. Don't try to fancy it up. Don't try to have a version that sounds better than or more impressive or more worthy than what is really going on in your life. Just bring to Jesus the place where you need him and give it to him. To talk to God about it in prayer, asking for healing, for help, accepting Jesus' invitation to follow me. You know, maybe it's like, Jesus, I keep trying to keep up. I keep trying to keep up. I keep trying to prove my worth at work. I keep trying to show my boss that I'm good enough. I keep trying to do this. I keep trying to do this thing for my family or my spouse, and I just can't keep up. I can't seem to fix it. Jesus, I don't know what's going on. I just can't seem to do it. I keep trying to maybe cover it up or even hide it or put it off to the side, but I need your mercy. I need your invitation. I need you. You don't have to prove you're worthy to receive the welcome of Jesus. When Jesus welcomed Matthew, that welcome didn't just stay with Matthew. That's one of the things I love about this story, is that Jesus could have welcomed Matthew and they could have gone on and went on to the Wizard of Oz, or had their Yellow Brick Road experience or whatever. They could have just be buddies together. But that's not what happens when Jesus welcomes Matthew, because the welcome widens. Matthew invites his friends over. The welcome widens. Even the religious people, the guys that are on the outside of the story pointing fingers at the sinners, even they are invited in at these times. The welcome widens. And this month here at Kern Church, we're talking about what it means to love where you live. And I've been encouraging you to take this Love Where You Live challenge, where you just take one step, one small concrete step to invest deeper in your community, to love, to demonstrate and act in love where you live. And part of loving where you live is extending the welcome to others. But the reality is when you and I receive and realized that we are welcomed, when you and I receive and realize that we are invited, it's only then are we able to extend the welcome to others. The reason that you're able to welcome, the reason that you're able to love is because somebody loved you, somebody welcomed you, that Jesus invited you in. And when you realize that, you are better able to really love where you live. The only reason that you and I are able to welcome others and help others belong is because we are invited. We are welcomed. And that is at the core of what it means to love where you live. To love where you live. Because the welcome of Jesus is the reason we are called to live this out. The welcome of Jesus is the reason we are invited to partner with other followers of Jesus to live this out, to extend the welcome to others. And together, when we receive the welcome of Jesus, we can become slower to try to evaluate somebody else's unworthiness. We can become slower trying to put somebody into a category or judge them, but instead be more willing to ask the questions like, how can I extend the welcome to others? Who around me feels unseen? Who needs to know that there is room for them? Kern Church, we do not extend welcome and help others belong because everyone has to prove themselves worthy. We extend welcome because Jesus welcomed us, because Jesus invited us. And this is how the welcome of Jesus begins to move through a church, through a neighborhood, through a school, through a workplace, through a city, even through a whole community. This is how we love where we live. I began today asking a question. What would it change in your life? What would it change in your life if you truly believed you were welcome? What would it change in your life if you truly believed you were welcome? This is the welcome Jesus offers. This is the welcome Jesus offers. You don't have to prove you're worthy to be welcomed by Jesus. Friends, what do you need to bring to Jesus? What is going on in your life, your family, your health? What do you need to bring to Jesus? What do you need to bring to Jesus to receive the invitation and the welcome that he offers you? And my encouragement for you is to take that to Jesus, to just open your life up and give that need, give that thing that's hanging up in your life, give that thing that keeps you from truly living. Just give it to Jesus and ask Jesus to do something in your life, because after all, loving where you live begins when you are welcome to. So just receive that welcome today. Let me pray for you. God, thank you so much. Oftentimes when we think about doing things in our community, making a difference, it's really easy to focus on the outside. When I think about this Love Where You Live campaign, it's really easy to focus on doing things for others. But if I'm honest, God, it begins when you first welcome us. And so, Lord, I pray right now for anybody who's here today and they're struggling with being welcomed, that you'll just speak a word of hope to them. And if somebody has a need that they haven't yet given over to you, God, I pray that you would open it up in their lives and just receive them. Extend your welcome as you extended it to Matthew. And then help us live a life where your welcome widens. Give this all to you, God, in your blessed name, I pray. Amen.